Good morning. So what I'd like to talk about today is how you can use data as a reporting tool. So distilling ideas, complex ideas down is what reporting is at its heart. And you take them, you put them down to one or two little ideas, put a simple narrative around it, and then the reader is able to walk away with a deeper understanding of a very, very complex subject. There are a couple of pitfalls you have to watch out for, though. The first is if you leave too much complexity in your story, and this is very easy to do in data-driven journalism. If you leave too much complexity in, the reader just gets lost. They don't understand anything. It's a disaster. It's impossible to understand. Conversely, if you go the other direction and you end up sort of falling back on cliche because you're trying to make it as simple as possible, you rob the idea of its power if you fall back on cliche. So you have to find a way to take the middle ground in that. And nowhere is that more the case than in explaining a story like what happened in the Horn of Africa. How did the Somalia famine begin? What contributed to it? What caused it? So in terms of complexity, this is mind-blowing. So you have meteorology, ocean surface temperatures, the impact of a failed state, a militia group that uses starvation as a weapon of war. You have child soldiers, and ultimately you have market forces that come in and do their thing. So to try to distill this down for this project, what we wanted to do was to take as much data from all of these areas that we could come up with, put a simple narrative around them, and in about 5 minutes hope that someone could sit down and look at this database and this narrative and walk away with it going, I have a pretty good idea of how this happened. So the basic narrative that we came up with, and this was in talking to experts from the Horn here at VOA, talking to people on the outside at aid agencies and NGOs, this was the basic narrative, and it's pretty simple. So you have a drought. Then the drought causes crop failures. After that, the food prices spike. The market takes over, prices go up, and then ultimately you have massive internal displacement and migration. But that doesn't quite equal famine. We found out that you can have those conditions in other places and famines don't happen. The key final ingredients that caused this to happen was that you needed a failed state, so it doesn't have the coping mechanisms of a civil society to deal with something like this. And then ultimately you also need violent militias thrown in this case, Al-Shabaab, that really exacerbates a bad situation. So we'll go to the first one and kind of do a quick run through on how we did this. So drought, we were looking for hard data on specific, even down to the city level, so we could do overlays to say, where did it not rain, where did it rain, and then run through all these factors and really come up with some good mapping tools that explain this. Well, local rain sensors completely unreliable because, again, it's a very difficult country to operate in. Getting on-the-ground data didn't work. We looked at something called the vegetation index, which is actually using raw satellite data that measures the amount of chlorophyll from space and uses that as a proxy for water in an area. Well, that didn't work either. Way too much complexity, way too much information, and it was impossible to extract anything useful. We went to soil moisture. That didn't work either. But luckily, by digging around in some of this information, we found something called an XML stream, and in the XML stream was the raw information sitting behind all of this that gave us years worth of information on a week-by-week basis, even down to the city level of what went on across the entire Horn of Africa. So here's an important thing. When you go out and try to do data-driven journalism, first thing you have to do is get your hands on the information. There are 3 ways to do it. You beg, you dig, and you threaten. The first one, begging, is just finding the right person and saying, well, somebody has a spreadsheet, somebody has a database. This graphic here, for instance, that came out of an NGO, when you see something like that on a website, don't just take that and publish it as is. There is information behind that. You need to get back to that raw information, do your duty as a reporter or as an editor to get down to the absolute bottom of the source information. Next is dig. So we talked about taking the XML streams and deconstructing them, pulling them apart. Absolutely do that. And then finally, if you are working with a government that has public information laws and they by law have to disclose that information to you and they're balking, you can always threaten legal action. Next, look for surprises. So every single price went up. We were able to get commodities information on a city-by-city level as well. Everything went up except cattle. Why did cattle drop precipitously? Well, it turned out this is the last sign that something catastrophic is about to happen. Because everybody runs out and sells their animals because they're going to starve to death anyway, and it causes prices to collapse. So 2 closing points here. One, this was predictable. When you sit back and look at this, when the rains didn't come in the fall of 2010, this had been set in motion. And this was it almost had an air of inevitability to it. And secondly, when you look at these 2 line charts that you see at the top, they're global searches for the word Somalia and famine. no interest until the famine was declared, and then within 2 to 3 weeks, the interest completely collapsed. And so what came out of this is a crisis that was utterly predictable and a global community that quit caring within weeks of it happening. And we know that because we have the data to back it up. Thank you.